It's good to be with y'all today. It's 11 o'clock, and out of respect for your time and Terry and Philip's schedule, I'm going to go ahead and get started. If people continue to filter in, that's great. They can join us in progress. But I want to make sure we get all this information in. You signed up for this session, and I want to make sure that we maximize our time together. Does that sound fair? Yes. Fantastic. So this is the science of addiction and recovery. If that's what you intended on sitting in on today, you're in the right place. My name is Frazier, and I am the Executive Director of Focus on Recovery Augusta. It is a nonprofit organization located in Augusta, Georgia. It's a 501c3, and the mission of our organization is to assist individuals and their families to establish recovery from substance use disorder and other co-occurring mental health challenges. It's a pretty diversified platform that we kind of prop up. We're dealing, specifically with drug and alcohol abuse, but also process addictions, eating disorders, codependency, internet addictions, and the list goes on and on and on. We get approached about everything. Not going to really talk about the nuances of addiction today in this particular course. If you read the description of this, we're going to talk about the neuroscience. All right, so we are going to talk about what are the facts that we know scientifically, biologically. What are the things that occur with a human being when they enter into the process of addiction? Back in the 1930s, when traditional recovery supports were established, the Big Book was created. Everybody's probably heard or seen the movies, Dr. Bob and Bill and all them. They didn't know what they didn't know. We heard that earlier about addiction and about the human condition and what was happening scientifically and biologically to a person. But Dr. Bob was a good study. He had been watching people, devolve because of this disease. And although he didn't have the science to back it up then, he wrote some pretty strong literature that would ultimately lead us to understand what it is we know today. Something does happen to the mind cognitively. There is a breakdown that occurs, and we're going to talk about that this hour. There are things that happen biologically, and we can predict those things with a high level of accuracy. Not every single time, because this is a very complex disease. Because it's sociologically diverse. You've heard that this disease does not discriminate. Anybody ever heard that? There's a pretty wide group of individuals in this room across culture, gender, race, the list goes on, right? Age, so what affects me may not affect a person, the guy in the blue hat, much younger than me, right? We have different life experiences, different biological makeups, have experienced different things, both cognitively, right? So it's not going to impact us the same. There are a lot of factors that play into what we're going to talk about today, and I want y'all to keep that in mind. If we are dealing with such a complex sociological disease, and let's keep it in that frame, right, then the solution cannot be a one-size-fits-all. It cannot be you need to go to these meetings and sit in these green chairs for 1 hour at a time and you're going to be okay. It doesn't work that way. That doesn't take into consideration all the other factors that I mentioned, so we have to really take into consideration the science behind some of this. That's why I wanted to come and talk to y'all today. Does that sound good? Is that why you're here?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Wow, I thought I turned those off. How bad? So I want to get y'all involved a little bit. Y'all been sitting for a long time listening to other people talk on stages. Somebody tell me, what is addiction?
I'd say being hung up on something.
Okay.
Something you can't do without.
Okay.
Something that you may choose to do without, but for some reason you just can't leave it alone.
Okay. You were saying something, ma'am?
I'm just going to say it's a compulsive need for either a substance or behavior, something that, like someone said, can be toxic for you. It may be a behavior, it may be a substance, so lots of things can be addiction.
Does everybody fundamentally agree with all that?
I think about it being chemically induced.
It's a portion of it, sure.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
A false support system.
Okay.
Something that thinks is supporting
Okay. All right answers. Okay. So for the purposes of the discussions that we're having today, you heard me say they're all right. None of those are wrong. This is how I want us to think about addiction. I'm not saying that my way is right? That clearly SAMHSA and several other organizations have a textbook definition. But here's what I want us to focus on today. Addiction is an attempt to feel some kind of way or not feel some kind of way. Okay? An attempt to either feel something or to stop feeling something. Right? So we use some of these explanations or descriptors that talked about being hung up, leaning into something inappropriate. And what I want you to begin to think about as a new terminology, a new language, is self-medication. Not addiction, but self-medication. And that can extend beyond pills and booze. It can be this. You ever caught yourself or someone you love or sitting at a table with someone you respect and they won't look at you because they're constantly looking at that? And you see them. You can see their hands, right? Their thumbs, they're scrolling. It's an impulsive, compulsive behavior, right? And it's running through the fabric of our society now. It's become very normative. Eating could be another, right? So I want you to see what I'm doing here is we're not focusing on just the drugs, but the addiction itself, the self-medication piece. There's something that we're trying to compensate for because we either want to feel a certain way or we don't want to feel a certain way. I feel too much. I want something that brings me down. I don't feel enough. I need something that stimulates me. And that can be a substance or it can be a behavior like was mentioned before. Are we all in agreement on that? Does that all kind of jive? I heard the word choice. And I don't want to, have one of those finger in the chest type moments here, right? Does anybody believe that addiction is a choice? It's okay if you do. Yeah?
Starts
Okay.
at the beginning.
So I want to
Disease of choice.
Sure. I want to spend some time on this for just a moment, okay? Because this is a dynamic conversation. You mentioned this word, addiction. It resonates with everyone now. This is not 30 or 40 years ago where we had that one black sheep in the family that nobody talked about, right? At church, at work, anywhere. But now it's in every house, in every neighborhood, all over our country. 1 in 4 Americans are directly touched by the disease of addiction. Who knows what the leading cause of death in America is right now?
Drug overdose.
It's not. It's not. It's heart disease. Who knows what the leading cause of heart disease in America is? Obesity. Is obesity a choice? To some degree. It's a very dangerous conversation, but to some degree, is it?
For some, but there can be metabolic disorders
You're not wrong.
that make it difficult for people.
Absolutely. Second leading cause of death in America. Anybody ever been touched by cancer in their family? You know what the leading cause of cancer in America is? Smoking. Smoking a choice?
Yes.
100%. There's nothing metabolic or, generationally passed down hereditarily that causes someone to smoke, right? Third leading cause of death in America is addiction-related deaths across all spectrums. So the 3 leading causes of death in America all have some form of choice involved with them, don't they? I would suggest to you that we kind of take that portion of the discussion out of our vernacular. Choice or not, we're talking about human beings here. All who, given the opportunity, I promise you, would choose differently now that they've endured the things that they've endured. How's that sound? Okay. So we talked about who it affects, right? Is anybody immune to this in this day and age? Covering all things, right? The drugs, the alcohol, the process addictions. I think in pretty much any degree we look at it from, we're all, probably addicted to something in some regard. I've gone through phases in my life. It's hunting season, right? I was addicted to hunting for a while. Couldn't stop buying hunting related products, trying to get out to the woods to change my SD cards and my cameras, watching TV shows on the outdoor channel, and then it kind of lost its hold over me. It's also football season. You start ignoring things or, people so that you can watch the big games on Saturdays or Sundays, spending extra money you probably shouldn't on merchandise or things like that. Lots of us do. Seems harmless, right? But for some, that jersey you bought for the Braves, that was the power bill, right? And we're talking about decisions, we make here. And I'm trying to keep it lighthearted because we can become too concentrated on the wrong things simply because they seem harmless. It's not hurting anybody.
Right.
You ever heard, who in here has someone in their life that's addicted to something? Right? They ever told you, don't worry about what I do, I'm not hurting you? Right? And that can be said about a lot of our interest or concentrations, couldn't it? You take that and lay it back over the top of yourself, you're like, ooh, man, that's kind of gross. So we need to change the lens that we look at people through. I want us to stop looking at them first as addicts or alcoholics, or degenerates, the black sheep in our family, those people that we don't want to talk about. And I want us to look at them as to what happened. We need to begin to get to the why. How did this occur? Why are you making the decisions that you're making? How are things unfolding for you the way that they are? Instead of, I need you to do different. I need you to do better. I need you to stop. You're hurting us. You're doing this to us. Your decisions are making us. What happened? What can I do different? So it's going to be hard, right? But it's possible. And it will create better, more measurable outcomes. I think that everybody in your family system will benefit from. So, are you qualified to be in here? And I meant to, do all these fancy animations. We're going to have these things flow in, So we already talked about who knows someone in active addiction. Does anybody know anybody in recovery from addiction in here? Fantastic. So put those hands back up if you know somebody in recovery. Everybody look around. Now put your hands back up if you know somebody in active addiction. This is symbolic of the statistics that we know in America. And I'm going to put some of those up here in a moment. All right, it went from about 3/4 to the room to the whole room, didn't it? Did everybody see that? Yeah, it's startling. Who knows someone that has been in recovery and gone back into addiction? Did it happen during the pandemic? Some of y'all? Yeah. Who knows someone that's passed away as a result of their addiction? Me too. I run a center that is responsible for the recovery population as well as the still active using community. We provide overdose reversal medications, Narcan. We also provide clean needles, condoms, all harm reduction items to decrease the risk of the spread of HIV, hepatitis, and a list of other things. And it gives us a window into a world that is nightmarish to watch. Last month, I know, because we just did the numbers at our center alone, we did 28 overdose reversals. We lost 7 people. I mean, it's hard to sit with. They talk about compassion fatigue, and most of us experience it a lot of the time. But that's what makes me qualified. The other thing that makes me qualified is I am a person living in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. What that means is that I haven't felt the need to self-medicate since 2008. I would experience a setback in my recovery in 2014 due to a divorce, high emotionality. I ran to the liquor store. I almost drank myself to death in 3 weeks. I was in the ICU for 7 days after having not used anything for 5 years. I speak out about recovery because the voiceless need a voice. They need to know that they have a champion. I'm not anonymous because anonymity breeds shame, in my opinion. It breeds stigma. And in order to reduce the shame and stigma, we need to increase education. I'm a father. I'm a son. I'm a husband. I'm an advocate, an ally. I'm a lot of things, none of which can really define who I am as a man. I am greater than the sum of all of my parts. That's also what qualifies me. So we are going to be talking today. As we're 15 minutes in, I want to leave some time at the end for questions. I also want to give you some freedom. If we get to a part that you feel really compelled to ask a question about, I want you to please feel free to do so. I want to address it right then and there. I want us to have, an organic discussion that is meaningful and impactful. If you are a person who struggles with asking questions in public, save them till the end. I will make myself available. I'll stay here and talk to you as long as we need, or catch me back over in the big room over there, and we'll discuss. Okay? So everybody feel free to do that. Does anybody else need anything else to happen in the next 45 minutes for you to feel safe, or for you to feel confident to participate in this that I can help with? Everybody good? Okay. All right. So we are going to go over some national statistics. We're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences for a moment, the neuroscience itself, specifically what happens to the brain and the body through the continued reintroduction of synthetic substances. The deconstruction of the brain pathways, dopamine dysregulation, and you can read the rest up there. You're all adults. So I know I was taught a long time ago to never put a lot of information on one PowerPoint slide because people will completely lose their minds. I did it anyway, deal with it. There are a lot of statistics in the United States of America about addiction. If you go out to the CDC website, SAMHSA, if you just Google addiction statistics, you're going to find more information than you ever wanted to know. Among Americans aged 12 years and older, 31.9 million are current illegal drug users or have used within the last 30 days. Is anybody shocked by that age number? You shouldn't be. I drank for the first time when I was 9 years old. It was Jack Daniels. It was my stepfather's. It was on the counter. I filled up the cap. I drank it, and I knew that something that had previously been missing from me was finally in place. Like an element of my DNA was finally put into its socket. And I knew I would never be the same at 9 years old. I'm also a person who lives successfully with several mental health diagnoses, clinical depression, anxiety, PTSD. So when I talk about self-medication, that's what I mean. There are elements of me. If everybody wakes up here, and this is the baseline in terms of their mood and their personality and their ability to regulate, I wake up here. And I need several things to happen throughout the day for me just to get to baseline and then above. And for the longest time, that was self-medication. That was alcohol, pills, in order for me to feel the way that I thought was normal. And that's happening, as early as the middle school years. Both of my children are in high school now. But I can tell you, as recent as last year, my daughter was in 8th grade. There was an overdose at her middle school. A kid brought a pill to school that they had gotten from their older brother who played on the football team in high school, OD'd in the bathroom and died. She was walking home with a friend at the end of 7th grade. She was like, "Hey, can I go to their house? It's the last day of school." I was like, "Yeah, absolutely, have fun." They got home, and the mother of the girl that she went home with was dead on the couch from an overdose. Children are being exposed, because I told you this runs through the fabric of all of our homes now, at very early ages. And this is just, I'm telling you addiction-related things. I'm not talking about the trauma, that people are experiencing. Reaching all the way back to 2008. Most people can remember the housing crisis that we went through, the banking, the bursting of the bubble, right? And the anxiety that we all felt and has now been generationally passed down. We can see that anxiety in our children now. It's top of mind with them all the time. So let's keep going. 11.7% of Americans 12 and over use illegal drugs. 53 million, or 19.4% of people 12 and over, have used illegal drugs or misused prescription drugs within the last year. And the list keeps going on and on and on, right? I saw some of you taking pictures. You should share it. This is important information. A few more statistics. Drug abuse and substance disorders are more likely to affect young males. 22% of males and 17% of females used illegal drugs or misused prescription drugs within the last year. All of these, it's kind of changed who we are as a country. If I could turn this TV on to cable and I'd make you a $100 bet. Within 10 minutes of this being on any normal channel, ABC, NBC, CBS, I bet you we see a prescription drug commercial in the first 5 minutes, or a beer commercial. Right, we are losing a marketing war with several different very high-profile companies that want nothing more than to keep this country feeling the way they want to feel. Right? We all feel a certain way, and getting back to the point that I was making, we either want to feel that way or we don't want to feel that way, and there are plenty of things in place that are going to make sure we feel exactly how we want to feel. It's the new American way. You can't read most of these because they're too small. But I want to talk about the pandemic year because it's important. In 2015, we experienced around 68,000 overdose deaths in America. Last year, as a result of the pandemic, an increase in relapse rates, everybody living in this heightened state of fear and anxiety, that vaulted up to 96,000 overdose deaths.
Is there any distinction between the ones that are intentional and those that are not?
From a statistical standpoint, we only know what's reported,
Yes.
And to dig into that fine portion of the data, there is a difference, but it's minute, right? There are individuals who meant to use but didn't meant to overuse and die. So does that answer your question? It's small, percentage-wise. But 96,000 overdose deaths. Now, considering addiction as a whole, because I told you it was the third leading cause of death in America, in any given year, we're talking about 800,000 plus deaths. That takes all things addiction related into consideration, drinking and driving, the things that happen to a person biologically, which we'll get into some, because it plays into heart disease and, liver function and so on. But we're in the midst of an opioid epidemic, and up until the time that coronavirus came onto the scene, we were talking about the opioid epidemic a lot. And did you notice that disappeared? We didn't talk about it anymore. And rightfully so. The epidemic, the pandemic that we are still currently dealing with, most important conversation to be had at the time that it was really relevant. And hopefully we are on the backside of some of that. But the opioid epidemic didn't go away. Right? People continue to die at record levels. Getting back to college football, just for example purposes, right? Georgia, Carolina, Clemson, that about cover everybody in the CSRA in this room right now. I don't know which of those stadiums is the biggest. I know that Georgia holds about 92,000 people. 96,000 people in 2020 died. That is more than a football stadium worth of people leaving this earth, just like that. That is almost a plane crashing every single day in the United States. That is 9/11 every 3 weeks. If a plane crashed in this country every single day, what would happen? It would be huge. You'd hear about it on every channel, on every NPR and radio station that does.
All air travel till we got it fixed.
There would be people in front of Congress having to answer. They would never fly again. People would never fly again. It would be an outrage. If this was a movie theater shooting happening every single day, there's about the same number of people that fit in a movie theater as there are in an airplane. this country would lose its mind. But because it's a bunch of people dying from what a lot of folks believe is a choice, it's like they kind of got what they deserved, right? That's hard to sit with when you think about it that way. But these are people's sons and daughters, nieces and nephews, fathers, mothers, grandparents. You want to talk about unintentional overdoses? You know, you have that senior individual who had her hip replaced, you know, and they cut her out 2 months worth of Percocet or Oxy to deal with the pain from going through physical therapy. She forgets that she took her dose at 2 p.m., takes it again at 2:30, and she's ODing at 3. And she gets lumped into that statistic. You know, when people are sharing about what people deserve or don't deserve on social media, do they take her into consideration? No. We have to look at people differently. We have to look at this disease differently if we're ever going to create meaningful change in the way people are treated because they deserve that kind of treatment as a human being. So, I want to talk about very quickly, anybody ever heard of the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences? Okay, this is important. You know, the National Institute of Health, the Drug Control Policy Forum, any other governmental agency that I could probably rattle off to you right now. My organization would love to tell you that we have a national epidemic in terms of drug addiction, right? The truth is that we don't have a drug epidemic in this country, and we always will, by the way. You know, the opioid epidemic is in its like third evolution. Opioids were introduced to this country back in the Civil War. You know, and we have struggled with them for millennia. You know, and next we're going to experience a methamphetamine epidemic. When we finally get our hands and regulate through policy our way out of the opioid epidemic, we're going to be in another one that's even more terrifying, I promise you. You know, as an expert who watches these things. You know, we watched an entire generation of human beings be prescribed Adderall, you know, rightfully so in the beginning, you know, but it's spun out of control now. And it is going to evolve when the industry gets regulations put on it the same way we did with opioid medications, moving over to crystal meth. We're already seeing it beginning. You've probably begun seeing it in your schools, in the youth that you have in your families. It's terrible. There will always be a drug epidemic in this country, constantly, because of trauma, because of the things that people are attempting to self-medicate. Depression, anxiety, suicidality, domestic violence, sexual violence, abuse, neglect, abandonment, bullying, divorce, the list goes on. Right, you know, you think about our soldiers, the things that they've been asked to do in theaters of war, and they come back. They don't know how to deal with some of that. And the system to help them is not fundamentally great. I'm not going to tell you it's bad either. I'm not going to be that guy, but it's not good enough. And most of them won't even have the resources to access the level of care that they deserve. And that's true of a lot of our population. 9 out of 10 people who deserve some kind of formal or clinical treatment won't get access to that level of care because of affordability. We have a trauma epidemic. And it's...
Yeah, no, I think it's...
I bet.
You know, with the I don't know, I think
it's not being dealt with fundamentally. We have a system of care that can put an adult human being back together. It put me back together. It's put millions of people back together. You know, we have 29 million people in active addiction in this country. And we have 27 million people in active recovery. Like I said, that was indicative of the responses in the room. And most of them are all in the position that they're in because of the things that they've experienced, that were allowed to just kind of like be passed on. I went and taught in all 5 of the Columbia County high schools the year before the pandemic hit. And we asked them several pointed questions. The Most of the ones that I asked you as well. Who knew somebody who was addicted? Who knew somebody who was in recovery? Who knew somebody that relapsed? Who knew somebody that died? The numbers were startling. All right, I keep using that type of language because I want you to really remember it. But if you talk to a lot of our young folks these days, and if you think back to the stories that you've heard, but maybe friends that you have now that's your age, the things that they've gone through, and I can tell you as a man, a lot of that stuff I bottled up for the longest time. Because I was incorrectly taught that I shouldn't have feelings, that I shouldn't be afraid, that I shouldn't cry, that I shouldn't talk about the things that I'm scared of. You know, I was essentially set up to die on top of my white horse. And I did, several times, only to be brought back, thankfully, right? But that's, you know, kind of what we continue to do is kick that can up the road and be like, oh, well, they'll figure it out in the next stage of their life. I know times are tough for them right now, but they're going to get that job, or they'll finally start dating, or, you know, they'll make that team. Everything's going to be fine. They're going to work this out. But I'm telling you, based on the numbers, you know, all that data that was on those slides that I should have split up differently, it's not happening. And it's not changing. And it's because we keep looking at this disease and the people that are impacted by it all wrong. So we need to talk about what we can't see in order to change what it is we can see. You know, when we look at a person that we find out is addicted to drugs, to alcohol, to pornography, to whatever it is that we find adverse, right? You know, we see that as a representation of how addiction has made us feel. If you have a person in your family or a person that you've cared about and they have exhausted you emotionally, mentally, spiritually because of their addiction, that has made you feel some kind of way. It's left a signature on you, and every person you come into contact with is going to understand that lens that you look at people through. And it's not your fault. It's just how we've always been taught to operate, especially with this disease. Because it has carried shame and stigma with it for so long, because we love to look at the things that people do instead of what's happened to them. They stole money from your mom, right? Ugh, shame on them. Another DUI, another incarceration. One more thing that they did that seems like some kind of slight to their existence. Instead of us, you know, constantly kind of checking off, oh, look what Christian did again. Nobody ever goes, has anybody ever asked him why he does the things that he does? You know, but we get tired of it so quickly with this particular population of individuals. Got to get to the whys. At 2 years old, my father died in a drunk driving accident. At 9 years old, I was raped by a Boy Scout camp counselor. I'm on my third stepfather, all of which beat me to make sure that I knew who was in charge when they were on site. I had my arm broken in the driveway of our house, trying to help one of them change the oil in the car so I could learn how to be a man. Spilt the oil pan and he broke my arm with the oil filter. I was constantly put on to recreational sports so that nobody had to deal with me. Sports became a part of my identity for that very reason. And then in college, when I got hurt and I couldn't participate anymore, I lost an element of my identity. Bullied all the way through middle school and high school because of my size until I finally became this 6 foot, 250 pound, person. That all changed. But then when I had the abilities, that's where my rage engaged. And I exacted all the things. So then I got arrested. And getting into the penal system was traumatizing. So of course, if you heard that story, you're like, of course he was addicted. That makes sense. But we have to get to the whys. We just assume, that they're making choices because they want to get high. When in fact, they just want to stop feeling some kind of way, right? So this is an actual brain scan. I love it because on the left, on each side, different viewpoints of the brain itself. So we see a normal brain with all things firing the way that they're supposed to, right? And then the addicted brain, as we refer to it, kind of dark, right? And we're going to talk about that now because we have about 25 more minutes, and this is the real meat and potatoes, okay?
What are we seeing? Is that electrical flow or is that blood flow?
Correct.
What's stimulating?
Electrical activity, right? The stimulated brain activity, depressed brain activity. So I know most of you are not neuroscientists. Just so you know, I'm not either, but I am certified to deliver this information. But this is what we're looking at, the brain. Brainstem, midbrain, prefrontal cortex, right? And I'm going to get more into this in the next slides. And I need us all to agree that we know that the brain operates through kind of an electrical current system, right? Does everybody understand that? Fundamental biology? Yes, good, we can advance. All right, so what does the prefrontal cortex do? Because it's the most vital of the conversation that we're going to have today. There are 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex that you need to take into consideration for the discussion we're having. Empathy, insight, response flexibility, emotional regulation, body regulation, morality, intuition, attuned communication, and fear modulation. Does everybody kind of recognize all of those different motor systems? Yeah? Can you tell as a normal operating human being that you employ most of these on a regular daily basis? Yeah? So the limbic system, which sits midbrain, so remember if I showed you the previous slide, right above the spinal column, that is where our fight or flight or freeze responses happen, as well as our ability to reason about, is this safe? Is this something that people want me to do? And our emotions live here, okay? Anybody have any additions to this or want to take any more pictures? I saw some folks doing it. There we go. All right. So as we receive signals, quick science. As things happen to us, as we participate in things, whether they're events or conversations, public speaking, right? That's what I'm doing right now. So I could tell as it was like 10:50 and I was beginning to make my way over here. I was very relaxed. I was sitting in the other hall. I was having coffee. But I felt my heart rate beginning to kind of ramp up. I could feel like my skin was beginning to crawl a little bit. I was getting goosebumps on and off. I was getting ready. My adrenaline was beginning to spike a little bit. I love public speaking, by the way. I'm not terrified of it at all anymore. I think that I can remember the first time I talked in front of a crowd about this size, like shaking. I was so happy to have the podium, right? Anybody ever experienced that? I wanted to do it. I wasn't afraid, but I could not regulate, those different body systems that were necessary for me to kind of get my emotions under control. It has everything to do with my brain and the narrative that I tell myself about what's going to happen. How are they going to perceive me? Am I going to talk in a way that is, smart, and well received? And so that has everything to do with our fight or flight, with our, that being stimulated, and lots of things beginning to happen biologically and cognitively, and my prefrontal cortex over time, through a learned behavior of just continuing to do this, was like, you're cool, this is fine, you've done this 100 times, it's gonna be great. Everybody loves tall, bald guys, they're super handsome. Yeah, I knew y'all were with me. But so things happen to us, or we experience things, or we participate in things, and we have a biological and cognitive response to them. We identify things as safe or dangerous. We make choices about whether to, engage or stand on the periphery, and just watch. And it's all based on our experiences. Does anybody ever go hiking? Yeah? I like to hike the Appalachian Trail. It's one of my favorite things to do in this world. You know what's on the Appalachian Trail? Bears. I'll never forget the first time I saw a bear, right? And I knew it was a possibility. I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos and I've been reading a lot of books about other, through hikers and their experiences. And I was like, there's a good chance I'm gonna see a bear. But you think about movies like The Revenant or that, what was that, Anthony Hopkins movie, with the bear attack and Baldwin. I can't remember the name of it. It was a fantastic movie. You think about things like that and you're like, I'm gonna get mauled to death. This is gonna be terrible. That's not how it went, but when I smelled him before I saw him. I don't know if you've ever been near a bear, but they smell like a 250-pound wet dog, right before the shampoo. And I was like, here we go, and so like my body, immediate goosebumps, and I became hyper aware, and I was constantly like checking my surroundings, where's my knife, my trekking poles, did I make myself look big, right? Be noisy, they tell you, don't run. Those were all my choices, and so now when I still hike, sections, and I know that it's a possibility, and when it happens though, it's different, just like with the public speaking, because I'm prepared. I've experienced that. I wouldn't say that I've become numb to it, but my body has become conditioned to a response that is appropriate with the stimulus that I'm going through. Does that make sense? It's not different with addiction. Things become more normal the more that you experience things. And so when we introduce things into our body, they kind of align with our hierarchy of needs. And I'm gonna go back because we're not quite ready for this slide yet. But when we introduce a substance like cocaine, heroin, marijuana, alcohol, any of those things, a response happens, an electrical current is stimulated into our brain, and if we talk about the fight or flight response, because most of us grew up being told that drugs were bad. Don't do drugs. And my generation, it was just say no, right? Nancy Reagan walked that out. It was adopted as a national campaign, and it was a really oversimplification. I also thought that there were going to be a lot more people offering me drugs for free, just walking around my neighborhood. That never actually happened. I thought that I was going to be on fire a lot. That's why I was taught to stop, drop, and roll so much. None of those things played out quite like they told me to. And I also didn't say no, when the opportunity presented itself. But that we were told the dangers. There was the whole frying pan and the eggs. Does anybody remember that one? That was classic. I knew drugs were bad. I knew that they were dangerous. I knew that they could kill people. They killed my dad. He died in a drunk driving accident. I knew the possibilities of the choices, the consequences that would be associated with my decision making. I just didn't care because I wanted to feel some kind of way that I didn't. So despite everything I knew, I still made a choice. Like, so it was a choice, right? That's okay. That being said, the thing that happened biologically that allowed me to continue making that choice was the hormone production that it created. Almost all drugs are some form of a carcinogen, which are really bad for the human body, right? We know that. There's no discussion around that. Carcinogens are bad. But synthetically, the way that a lot of these drugs are designed, they kick off these false hormone spikes that trick our brain into believing that they're good for us because of the way the hormones make us feel. So the way you feel when you see your grandchildren, when you see the Braves win, when you win the lottery, when you make it to the gas station before the empty light completely goes dark, right? That dopamine, that serotonin, that thing that makes you feel warm and fuzzy, drugs give you an astronomical amount of that. More than you can make through general human production. Okay? I didn't put it in here because it creates a lot of conversation, which wastes a lot of minutes in a presentation that should be about 2 hours long. But you think about something like marijuana. Creates a 200% increase in dopamine production than we are capable of making on our own. Alcohol is about the same. And you get into the stimulants like cocaine, methamphetamine, 700 to 800% increase in dopamine production than we can make on our own. Who knows what probably the biggest one is? Most dangerous drug on the planet that will create the largest spike in dopamine. It is heroin. They have done, so this is, when I talked about what we know now that they didn't know previously, like they have done so many tests over so many decades, hooking people up to nodes, letting them take drugs in scientifically safe situations and measuring this is how we know everything that we know, right? Because it's been studied. Heroin creates a 2,000% increase in hormone production in the brain. 2,000% above what we are capable of making organically. Jumping out of a plane doesn't even give you that big of an increase. Seeing your child for the first time doesn't give you that much dopamine. It's inhuman the way that we refer to it. And it's the reason that it is the most addictive and deadly drug on the planet. It's the worst gift that was ever given to this planet. The worst. It's the reason that 96,000 people are dying per year now. So, anybody got a brand new car in here? So I want to talk about what this can mean over time, right? What kind of car you got? Nissan Rogue? Yep. It's a good car. My mom's got that car. Brand new Nissan Rogue, right? Anybody ever driven from here to Atlanta before? Straight drive, right? Really boring, really pretty easy, You just get on I-20 and boom. Hour and 30 minutes from now, depending on your speed. So I want us to play a little thought game, right? Brand new Nissan Rogue, everybody aware of that car? Okay. If that car, gas is not an issue, legalities are not an issue, there'll be no police, there'll be no other cars on the road. Could you drive that Nissan Rogue 100 plus miles an hour from Augusta to Atlanta?
Absolutely.
Sure, of course you could. I've done it, maybe. Don't tell me about that. How many times could you make that trip though? All things considered, no police, no cars, no gas is not an issue. How many times can that Nissan Rogue make that trip at 100 plus miles an hour? Till it fails, right?
Yes.
How many times will that be though?
They won't.
You don't do any service to the engine, it's going to fail eventually.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I didn't give you that part, but it will eventually. Things will wear out, wires will wear thin, they'll overheat, friction, from the loss of oil, viscosity and all that, right? Eventually it's going to break down. How many times though? We don't know. Could be 30, could be 100, could be the first one. Maybe there was a malfunctioning piece put into that engine, that has not been recalled yet, and the first time you try and drive that car over 100 miles an hour, the engine fractures and you're done. It's out of the road. It's all a possibility, right? It's the same with drug addiction and these huge spikes in electrical hormone production. How long can that last in the human brain? We don't know, for a lot of different reasons: environmental, sociological, biological. Someone could use a prescription opioid pill and die the first day because the brain was not prepared to receive it. There was something that fired off that couldn't or shouldn't have, and they die. And there's another person who'll use heroin or pills or drink for 40 years. And you wonder, how? How in the world? We don't know. It's different for everyone. Each brain, although it will react similarly, so different. I know we didn't talk a lot about this slide yet, and it goes back to some of those adverse childhood experiences. So this hierarchy of needs begins to develop at birth. We begin to seek out our physiological needs first, water, food, safety, sleep as a child. You can't communicate that you need these things. I mean, you can actually. Toddlers and children, newborns do communicate. Not the way that we do today, right? That has to be learned. But those are the things that they immediately need as a human being. And then they begin to learn about safety. There's that, you only touch the stove once when it's hot, right? Or don't talk to that guy in that van over there at the park just because he's got candy. Or we don't talk to strangers, or we, don't go out of the house after this time. We drive with our seatbelts on. They begin to understand those concepts. Love and belonging. Everybody will have that first girlfriend or boyfriend, or, that intimacy that they share with their parents or their siblings, their best friends. Then we get into esteem, the way that they feel about themselves, and finally that self-actualization, where they believe that anything is possible. And this is important, right? It probably belongs somewhere else in the conversation, but when a person who is 9 years old, 12 years old, begins to use, while the brain is still forming, all of these hierarchy of needs, it becomes completely dysregulated. That little girl that's raped by a family member, or a kid at school, a kid who is abused by a father or a mother, that one that is constantly beat up at school, the one whose both parents died because of overdose or in a car crash, right? Anything that disrupts this hierarchy of needs, you have to realize that everything builds on each other. If the safety was lost because of abuse or abandonment or neglect, we never really get to love and belonging, do we? You can talk to lots of victims of abuse and find out that they never had true relationships because of the way that they felt. So you really never get to self-actualization of it. And then, of course, the addiction makes sense. And this is why we have to get to the whys. This is why we have to dig into the reasons why people do what they do. This all has to do with the cognitive makeup. Their brain has been dysregulated. I would love, this is why we saw, this will help with a little bit of understanding with like policy and such. Anybody remember when the drinking age was 18 in America? Yeah. And then it moved to 21. Do you remember that? I'm telling you, ideally as an expert, I'd love to see it move to 25. Because that is when the brain reaches full maturation. Ossification is what they call it, right? And all the cognitive processes and all the ability to mature and all of these particular hierarchy of needs to eventually be met happens around that time. And any introduction of substances prior to that just dysregulates the whole system. And then we wonder why they make the decisions they make. So let's talk about that some more before we run out of time. So we get back to the Nissan Rogue thought experiment, right? How many times can that car make that trip? We don't know. We determined that it could be any number. So when a person uses drugs or alcohol and they get that false spike of dopamine, those huge electrical currents passing through the system all the time, they wear out the neural pathways. It would be like walking over there and just flipping the switch on and off, on and off, on and off. It's designed to operate that way, right? But not in the regard that we're doing it. These bulbs, they can't take that constant on and off, right? Although they are designed to do so, they'll fail eventually, and so does the brain. The neural pathways become corroded by the constant electrical signals that are passing across them in a manner which is not befitting of their design, and they begin to shut down because they can't take it, right? And so anybody work in any of the, I guess I don't know the best way to, industrial factories, the plants, anything around here, anytime a system is overwhelmed, you shut that system down and you move all of that energy over to another system. Does that make sense? So these neural pathways, they get corroded, they devolve, right? And so they stop working and they move all that energy over to the other remaining neural pathways to try and carry the load for them, but that overwhelms them. But the person keeps using, and so the electricity current is, losing its ability to create the same effect is the way I want to put it. And the way that we would refer to this normally is a tolerance. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Whereas a person, early in their drinking career, 6 beers was sufficient, made them feel exactly the way they wanted to feel. But over time, as these neural pathways break down and they can't carry the same electrical currents, it takes 12, 18, liquor now, add in something else, right? Because they're still trying to get that desired effect. And I want you to remember, it's about feeling a certain way. And when tolerance increases and the brain is not rewarding us with the same amount of hormones, we have to work extra hard to create that. And this is where we see the true breakdown of the human individual. So when all that is lost, I want to go back up here a couple slides. I apologize. I want to remind you back to all the functions of the prefrontal cortex. So when we talk about the electrical currents passing from the body up through the midbrain, so coming up through that spinal column, hitting the limbic system first, right? And that's where we're making those decisions. Is this safe? Do I keep doing this? And obviously, once full-fledged addiction has set hold on a person, there are no choices there anymore. You just keep doing the compulsive, repetitive behavior. You remember these are the neural pathways that connect these two systems. The prefrontal cortex becomes lost entirely. All right, that would be where an element of the engine in the Nissan Rogue is completely taken offline because all power has been shifted to somewhere else, right? So this is the really best part. We talk about a person in full-fledged addiction has no access to empathy. So when you're having these conversations with them and they're like, you can't understand how your addiction makes us feel, and they're like, you're right, I don't. They cannot empathize with you. They don't have access to that functionality. Their ability to have insight into their decision making, completely gone. This is why they will use, as soon as they wake up or on their lunch break, drive drunk with their children, prioritize their addiction over family members and events, the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, don't care. Right? Because they have no access to this functionality. It's been taken from them. Response flexibility, emotional regulation. This is why they look like a dumpster fire most of the time, emotionally. Morality. You remember I highlighted that when we first came through here, and you're like, why do you do the things you do? I raised you differently. They don't have access to that functionality. Their addiction has created a loss to that. Their intuition and their fear modulation. And this is why they cross those lines in the sand. They're like, oh, I would never drink before 5 on a weekday, until they do. I would never drive drunk with my kids, until they do and they don't get caught and they think it's normal. I would never switch to needles, right? And then they do. And for the list goes on and it just gets scarier, I can promise you. Running out of time. So I think everybody kind of understands this, the way that you're looking at me very despondently. You're like, yeah, I recognize all that. That's terrible. The brain is actually gone into self-preservation mode. All right, the reason it shuts down the prefrontal cortex is to try and save the individual. Right, and so I can't tell you how fascinating the human brain is and why it's still the most powerful supercomputer on the planet, probably for another couple of years at least, until Elon Musk does a few more things. But it's really fascinating. The brain is actually doing this to protect itself against the human individual who continues to try and reintroduce these substances and dysregulates it. If a person lives, if they survive this addiction process, they establish recovery, right? The brain takes anywhere from 9 to 14 months to allow those neural pathways to reconnect. So if you're experiencing an individual in recovery for those first 60, 90, 180 days, they probably still seem kind of off. And they'll have these what we call white light moments, or these epiphanies, moments of clarity. And they're like, oh, that makes sense now. And they begin to problem solve much more efficiently. That is their brain coming back online. Within those first 90 days, they'll get 25% of this capacity back. Within the first 180 to 240 days, they'll get up to 75% of that capacity back, and within a year, give or take, right? Some biological and environmental factors, they'll get their full capacity back. And they can live a normal life, but there will be an addiction trauma signature left, right? So you think about a dog who's ever been popped too hard before, peed on the carpet, chewed up the edge of a table or something, and wham! No, sir. Next time you go to pet that dog, what happens? They like scoot that butt, they're like, whoa, what are we doing? Brain's kind of the same, so if it experiences another like increase in dopamine that isn't organic, that didn't create, it will begin to cause a person, to kind of dysregulate. Think about the pandemic. A lot of people were scared that year, forced back in their homes, isolation, fear and anxiety constant, right? It was rampant. That put them in a place of high emotionality. A lot of people relapsed, right? It made sense that they did. And so I know we're done. I apologize. I'm gonna let y'all go. Anybody who ever had someone that they loved in addiction that relapsed, how quickly did it take them to spiral out of control?
Usually, the first 6 months.
Days, weeks, and you're like, oh my God, how did this happen so fast? As soon as relapse happens, the brain shuts down completely. It fires off all those neural pathways, done. Right, and that's the trauma signature. That's the dog who's been hit too hard once. But there's always the ability to come back from that, and it will happen. I know we ran out of time. It's lunch. I don't want y'all to feel like I held you over. Please, like I mentioned, I'll be, over there to answer any questions you might have. Thank y'all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being an ally.